I mocked and made fun of my husband in front of my friends, at a business party. Everyone was having a lot of fun except my husband. Suddenly the worst happened. My husband came up to me and told me it was over. I never thought a few careless words would ruin everything. But there I was, at a business party, surrounded by laughter and clinking glasses, while my husband, Brian, stood at the edge of the room, isolated. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too caught up in the moment, too caught up in the fun. My friends and I had been drinking, and when someone made a snide remark about whipped men, I let out a laugh. A loud one. Then, I made the joke. I mocked him, my husband, in front of my friends. I can still hear my words echoing back at me, as if they were someone else's. I didn't mean them, not the way they came out, but it was too late. The room burst into laughter. Everyone was having a lot of fun. Except Brian. I should have noticed. I should have seen the hurt in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped. But I didn't. I was too caught up in myself, in being the life of the party. And then it happened, the moment that would haunt me forever. He walked up to me, his face calm but his eyes a storm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't cause a scene. He just leaned in, whispered, "It's over," and walked away. It hit me like a punch to the gut. The laughter around me faded into the background, replaced by a deafening silence. I wanted to chase after him, to take back every word, but I was frozen. The look in his eyes had said it all. This wasn't a joke to him. It was over. We were over. And now, all I can think about is how it started. How I let the person I love the most slip away from me. Part 2. How we met. I wasn't always this person, the kind who would mock the man she loves. I used to be someone different, someone who cherished every moment with Brian. We met in the most unexpected way, at a cafe, of all places. I was running late, spilling coffee all over myself, and he was the guy who stepped in with a napkin and a soft smile. That's how it started, simple, awkward, but endearing. Brian wasn't the type of guy the first usually went for. He was quiet, thoughtful, with a gentle humor that snuck up on you. But there was something about him, something that drew me in. He had this way of making me feel safe, like I could be myself without judgment. Our first date was nothing extravagant, just a walk in the park and hours of conversation. But it felt special. He listened, really listened, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I mattered to someone. It wasn't long before I fell for him. Hard. We shared everything, our hopes, our fears, our dreams for the future. He wanted to start his own business, something small, but something that would give him the freedom to live life on his terms. I admired that about him, his quiet ambition, his patience. Brian was never one to rush things. He believed in hard work, in building something from the ground up. And he believed in us. Looking back, I can still see the moment I knew I loved him. It wasn't some grand gesture or romantic declaration. It was a rainy day. We were supposed to go out, but the weather had other plans, so we stayed in, ordered takeout, and watched old movies. It was perfect. I remember looking at him, sitting there with his goofy smile, and thinking, this is it. This is what happiness feels like. Asterisk. We got married a year later. It wasn't a big wedding, just close friends and family, but it was perfect in its simplicity. I remember looking into his eyes as we said our vows, promising to love and support each other through everything. And I meant it. I really did. But somewhere along the way, I changed. Or maybe we both did. It wasn't immediate. At first, everything was fine. We were happy. But as the years passed, life got more complicated. Brian's business was slow to take off, and we started feeling the strain. I began climbing the corporate ladder, working long hours, attending more and more events. I loved the rush, the success, the validation. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I lost sight of the man I had married. Brian was still the same, kind, patient, supportive, but I wasn't. I became sharper, more critical, always pushing for more. More money, more success, more everything. And in my pursuit of more, I started to see Brian as less ambitious, less driven, less of a man, in some twisted, cruel way. I hate admitting that now. It makes me feel like a monster, but it's the truth. I started looking down on him, resenting his calm, steady nature, the very thing that had drawn me to him in the first place. I wanted him to be different, more like me. More ruthless, more aggressive, more willing to chase after what he wanted. But that wasn't who he was. It never had been. And instead of accepting that, I bullied him. Quietly, at first. Little comments here and there, suggestions that he wasn't doing enough, that he needed to step up. But as time went on, the jabs became sharper, the sarcasm more biting. I don't even know when it escalated to outright mocking him in front of others. Maybe it was a defense mechanism. Maybe I was trying to prove something, to myself, to my friends, to the world. I wanted to be seen as powerful, successful, and I thought belittling Brian made me look strong. It didn't. It made me look cruel. And now, all I have are the memories of the person I used to be, the woman who loved Brian for who he was, not for who I wanted him to be. That woman is gone, replaced by someone I barely recognize. Someone who can't take back the words that destroyed everything. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment when everything shifted, when my admiration for Brian turned into resentment. I've replayed it over and over in my mind, trying to figure out how I went from loving him to hurting him, how the girl who once cherished every moment with him became the woman who tore him down in front of others. At first, it was subtle, almost invisible. I didn't wake up one day and decide to bully my husband. No, it crept in slowly, like a poison, seeping into the cracks of our relationship. It started with my own insecurities, though I didn't realize it at the time. My career was taking off, and I was becoming someone I'd always dreamed of being, successful, confident, respected. I was earning more than Brian, climbing the ladder faster than I thought possible. People noticed me, admired me, envied me. I thrived on that attention, that validation. But with every step up, I started to notice something else. Brian stayed the same. He was happy with his small business, content to grow it at his own pace. He didn't care about impressing anyone, about the superficial measures of success that consumed me. And at first, that was fine. I told myself I admired his patience, his quiet determination. But as time went on, that admiration turned sour. I began to wonder why he wasn't more like me, why he wasn't pushing harder, why he wasn't as hungry for success as I was. And that's when the comparisons started. I'd go to these business events, surrounded by powerful men, CEOs, executives, leaders who were ambitious, ruthless, and driven. They talked about million-dollar deals, about expansion, about growth. They were impressive, magnetic, and I started to wonder why Brian couldn't be more like them. Why wasn't my husband the one people envied? It wasn't fair to him. I know that now, but back then, I didn't see it that way. I saw it as a reflection of my own inadequacies. I felt like I was doing all the hard work, achieving all the success, while Brian was content to coast along at his own pace. I started to feel embarrassed. Embarrassed that my husband wasn't keeping up, that he wasn't as successful or as ambitious as the other men in our circle. The first time I made a snide remark, it was almost by accident. We were at a dinner party with some friends, and someone asked about Brian's business. I jumped in before he could answer, making a joke about how he loves taking his time. Everyone laughed, including Brian, though I noticed the way his smile faltered for a second. It was a small thing, a tiny jab, but it gave me a sense of power. I didn't realize it at the time, but in that moment, I felt better about myself. It was like, by putting him down, I was lifting myself up. And it became a pattern, one I didn't even recognize until it was too late. I'd make these offhanded comments in front of friends, little digs about how relaxed Brian was about his business, how he wasn't in any rush to make it big. It was always disguised as a joke, something lighthearted, but deep down, I knew what I was doing. I was chipping away at him, bit by bit. And every time I did it, I felt that same rush of superiority. I never stopped to think about what it was doing to him. Brian wasn't the kind of man who would fight back, who would call me out in front of others. He'd just laugh it off, make a self-deprecating joke, and the conversation would move on. But behind closed doors, I could see the change in him. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He didn't laugh as easily, didn't meet my eyes as often. I told myself it was because he was busy with work, that he was just stressed. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was pushing him away, slowly but surely, and he was letting me. The worst part is, I didn't stop. Even when I saw the hurt in his eyes, even when I noticed how he pulled away from me, I didn't stop. Instead, I doubled down. Because the truth is, it wasn't just about Brian. It was about me. I was scared. Scared that I wasn't enough. That my success wasn't enough. That no matter how high I climbed, it wouldn't fill the void inside me. So I started taking it out on Brian. He became the target of all my frustrations, my insecurities, my fears. If I could make him look smaller, maybe I'd feel bigger. If I could point out his flaws, maybe no one would notice mine. It was a twisted logic, but it made sense at the time. It made me feel better, temporarily. I became more and more ruthless with my words. I started criticizing him openly, not just in front of friends, but in private too. I'd question his decisions, tell him he wasn't doing enough, that he needed to step up and be a man. I'd tell him he was lazy, that he didn't care about our future. I'll never forget the look on his face the first time I said those words. He just stared at me, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. And for a second, I almost took it back. I almost apologized. But I didn't. Instead, I told myself he needed to hear it. That I was doing him a favor by pushing him, by forcing him to confront his shortcomings. I convinced myself that I was helping him, that I was motivating him to be better. But I wasn't helping him. I was destroying him. And deep down, I knew it. I knew it every time I saw him withdraw a little more, every time I saw the light in his eyes fade just a little bit more. I knew I was hurting him, but I kept going. Because it made me feel powerful. It made me feel like I was in control. But I wasn't in control. Not really. I was spiraling, and I was dragging Brian down with me. Looking back now, I can see how toxic I had become. How I let my own insecurities and fears turn me into someone I barely recognized. I became someone who needed to tear others down to feel better about myself, someone who couldn't appreciate the quiet, steady love Brian had always given me. And the worst part is, I didn't even realize how much damage I had done until it was too late. By the time I understood the weight of my words, by the time I saw how far I had pushed him away, it was already too late. I had lost him. And it was my fault. All of it. I always thought Brian was unbreakable. That no matter what I said, no matter how many little digs I made, he would stay the same, calm, composed, forgiving. But there's a limit to how much one person can take, and I didn't see it. I didn't realize I was chipping away at him, bit by bit, until nothing was left. I had pushed him to his breaking point, and when he finally broke, it shattered both of us. It happened on a Tuesday, nothing special, just an ordinary day. We weren't at a party, we weren't around other people. It was just us, at home, sitting across from each other at the dinner table. I remember the silence, thick and heavy, hanging between us. It wasn't unusual by then. We hadn't had a real conversation in months, maybe longer. I don't even remember what we were eating. It was just another night where we barely spoke, barely looked at each other. I had spent the day at work, surrounded by people who admired me, who made me feel important. When I got home, I barely acknowledged Brian. I was tired, irritable, and I wanted to unwind. He had cooked dinner, as he often did, but instead of thanking him, I made a comment about how he had too much time on his hands. He didn't respond. He never did anymore. He just stared at his plate, moving the food around with his fork. The silence felt suffocating, and I hated it. I hated how we had become strangers in our own home, how the love we once shared had been replaced by this unbearable tension. So, I did what I always did. I made another sarcastic remark, something about how maybe if he spent less time cooking and more time focusing on his business, things would be different. I don't even remember the exact words, but I remember the tone, the sharp, biting edge to my voice, the way I said it like it was a joke when we both knew it wasn't. This time, though, he didn't laugh it off. He didn't make a self-deprecating joke or try to change the subject. He just sat there, staring at his plate. And then, slowly, he set down his fork and looked up at me. The look in his eyes, it wasn't anger. I had expected anger. I had expected him to finally snap, to yell at me, to tell me to stop. But it wasn't anger. It was something much worse. It was resignation. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. For a moment, I didn't understand. I had heard those words before, in movies, in arguments, but they had never felt real. Not like this. There was something final in the way he said them, something that chilled me to my core. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "You can't do what anymore?" He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in months. And in his eyes, I saw everything. The hurt, the exhaustion, the years of trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. "This," he said, gesturing between us. "Us. I can't keep pretending like everything's okay. It's not. It hasn't been for a long time." I felt a flicker of panic, but I pushed it down, telling myself this was just another one of our arguments, that he'd calm down and things would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just another argument. This was different. "Don't be dramatic, Brian," I said, trying to brush it off, trying to regain control of the situation. "We're just going through a rough patch. Everyone does." He shook his head slowly. "This isn't a rough patch, Claire. This is something else. Something I don't know how to fix." I opened my mouth to argue, to defend myself, to say anything to make it stop, but he cut me off. "You've been pushing me away for years, and I've let you," he said, his voice steady but full of sadness. "I kept thinking things would get better, that you'd come back to me, that we'd find a way to make it work. But every time I tried to reach out to you, you shut me down. You made me feel small. And I don't think I can take it anymore." I sat there, stunned. This wasn't how I had imagined it would happen. I had always thought if things ever got bad between us, we'd argue, we'd fight, we'd scream at each other, and then we'd find a way to fix it. But there was no anger in his voice. Just exhaustion. Defeat. "You don't mean that," I said, my voice faltering. "We can fix this. We just need time." Time," he interrupted, shaking his head. "We've had time. Years of it. And look where we are." I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest, but I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to fix this, how to take back all the hurtful things I had said over the years. "Brian, I'm sorry," I blurted out, the words feeling strange on my tongue. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I don't know. I was frustrated. But we can work through this, can't we? We've been through worse." He looked at me for a long time, and for a moment, I thought he might say yes. I thought he might give us another chance. But then he shook his head again, his eyes filled with a sadness I had never seen before. "I don't think I have anything left to give." The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to respond. All the power I thought I had in our relationship, all the control I had fought so hard to maintain, slipped through my fingers in that moment. "I love you, Claire," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But love isn't enough anymore. Not when it's so one-sided." I wanted to scream, to cry, to beg him to stay. But the words wouldn't come. I had spent so long pretending I didn't need him, pretending I was stronger without him, that now, when I needed him the most, I didn't know how to ask for his forgiveness. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, as if every step he took was final. "I'll stay at my brother's for a while," he said, not looking at me. "I think we both need some space." And with that, he walked away. The door closed behind him with a quiet click, and I was left alone in the silence of our home, a home that suddenly felt too big, too empty, without him. I sat there, staring at the empty chair where he had been, replaying the conversation over and over in my head. I had pushed him too far, for too long, and now he was gone. And the worst part was, I couldn't blame him. Not really. I had done this. I had driven him away with my cruelty, my need to control, my fear of vulnerability. I had thought I was so strong, so independent. But now, sitting there in the empty house, I realized how fragile I truly was. Because Brian was the best part of me. And I had lost him. Forever.